Hello and welcome to the Rippling Pages podcast with me, Liam Bishop, curating the best writers to help you with your writing. You're going to hear part 2 of my live conversation with Katharina Volckmer that was held at the Hyde Park Book Club in Leeds on May the 12th. In the second part of this conversation, you're going to be hearing Katharina talking about her second novel, Calls May Recorded for Training and Monitoring Purposes, once again. But this time you'll hear Katharina talking about mothers, fascinations and fears of clowns, and the role and purpose of the joke in literature. Now, as ever with the Rippling Pages, please do like, share, subscribe, follow, leave a review, or even just tell your friends about the show. It really does help the podcast. And Katharina's book will be available on bookshop.org.uk in the Rippling Pages bookshop, the link of which you can find in the show notes. This event itself was supported by Next Chapter Books in Leeds, which is a new independent bookshop in Leeds focused on women's writing. So buying from bookshop.org.uk will support bookshops like Next Chapter Books. Okay, let's get into it. Here's Katharina and I in conversation. Tell us, if you can, about his relationship with his mother. Can you give us some insights into that?
Yeah, I've realised that I find mothers much more interesting than fathers, because I always write the fathers out of the books, and they always they don't really make it into the books. And I think the relationship with the mother is, what I was interested in is that she sort of represents home for him, like Italy, the country where he came from when he was very little, and that's kind of his only connection, and the sort of I'm quite interested in this sort of how much of your old country you bring with you and how you bring it with you, and what your parents sort of represent in that connection. But also he has a very complicated relationship because she's very beautiful. She manages to find a lover, like all the things he doesn't really manage for himself. And I do think the relationships with our mothers are essential, no? I mean, that's kind of the person that, for better or for worse, will dominate your life and who you are. And yeah, I find myself writing a lot more about my mother than my father as well. I don't know, or thinking about her more. I don't know. It's to me a more interesting relationship.
You said the word dominate. Is that what you think?
Yeah, I think they do dominate whether you want it or not. Like, I read something today that a lot of even adult women are unable to sometimes differentiate between their feelings and their mother's feelings. Isn't that mad, you know?
I think
that you're still stuck there like a little baby, sort of attached. So
I think that's perhaps for parents in general, we perhaps find it difficult to get away from. We do feel our parents' feelings, I guess. But for Jimmie and his mother, what is he feeling as a result of her and their relationship?
He's jealous. He also depends on her because he lives with his mother. The kind of London problem where he can't afford his own flat. I mean, his financial situation is precarious. He has a 0-hour contract. And this thing that I think a lot of people of our generation maybe experience, that their parents are better off, and that we find ourselves unable to replicate their kind of financial stability, I want to call it. I certainly haven't been able to do that. But at the same time, he has freedoms that she wouldn't have had, you know. So it's that kind of, and it's very dramatic. I think he loves her deep down, but he also blames her for a lot of his problems, you know, even though she might not be solely responsible for them. Yeah.
When you introduce us, well, just one of the early scenes is where Jimmie's wearing her lipstick. And I love, there's this idea of clowns within the book. And I know that clowns makes a late reference in The Appointment. But you describe, and talking about emotions and feelings, you describe his mother as someone who is forever in love with her own sadness. And that makes me think of a clown drawing on its sad face, that, you know, grotesque kind of sad face. What is it about clowns and mothers, or what is it about clowns?
There was a portrait of a clown in my parents' bedroom.
Okay, we're getting into it now. Let's go.
And I find clowns quite scary. but at the same time, I think they are also very tragic, or there's something. Yeah, Jimmie is a bit like a clown, I think, and he sort of inhabits that space of, on the one hand, being quite free and free to do strange things that maybe other people wouldn't be doing, but at the same time being a bit of a not ridiculous character, but you sort of invite that into your life, no? If you act a bit like a clown. And the lipstick, I'm also interested in people who sort of, they take a little step back and they decide to do things a bit differently, or they say, well, how about if I don't participate in this anymore? And he just appears at work wearing bright lipstick one day, and he's just quite interested in how people react to that. And then he does also, because he's an unemployed or unsuccessful actor, and he does work at children's parties, or he worked once at a children's party as a clown as well, which was a bit traumatic, but a lot of unemployed actors do that, and and that's quite humiliating in a way. If you wanted to be an actor and then you end up, performing for 8-year-olds in Hampstead or something, that's quite cruel. So there's also a cruel element to that. I think that life forces you to become a clown sometimes,
Yeah, for me, it's the performative element of his life that he can't get away from, and even in calls may be recorded for training and monitoring purposes. There's this training element too, and there's a part of the novel where all the workers sit around and they go through these calls and they get dissected apart, and it's kind of someone as if thrust into the limelight and made to be a clown, made to be tragic.
Yeah, that's true.
A fall guy. That's the word I was looking for, isn't it?
And work can be very humiliating, but at the same time, it's also a space where you have to perform a certain role. Like, your colleagues will expect to see a certain version of yourself, which does not necessarily, I think, correspond to who you might be at home. And I think the thing about him, because this is his last day at the call center, he decides to, in some ways, to stop performing his role, right? He sort of breaks out of it, it cracks, and he sort of does the thing that people dream of doing at work. When you have this kind of shitty job, you want to, you want to do all of that. Like I used to work at, my life is so interesting, I used to work at Burger King's. Okay. And one of our colleagues at some point lost the plot, because one person always has to, do the drive-through on top of their normal shift.
Oh, they do that on top of
sometimes they do it on top, and you can hear, I think we could hear the calls in the back kitchen, and they said, today the drive-through is closed, why don't you go to McDonald's? They got fired for that. But everyone was so envious, they were like, oh, I wanted to do that. It's a small sort of thing, where you sort of suddenly crack and you just stop functioning, and I think I find that, what happens if you stop functioning at work?
Break out the uniform.
Because I think everyone has a fantasy of what they would like to do at work if, they could. But most people don't do that.
Well, just to let you know, folks, there is going to be time at the end for some questions if you have any, as I move to sort of a couple of my last questions. So if you have got some, perhaps have a think. But on the subject of what we do and don't communicate, and when we want to communicate something, as we've alluded to, the book is full of fantasies, imagery, jokes, often very funny, sometimes tragic, but these are the kind of things that leak out, aren't they, when we try and keep things down within us, when we try and keep the uniform on, so to speak, the psychological uniform, perhaps. Why is Jimmie communicating in this way? And is he conscious of that? Is this a way of Jimmie becoming conscious, or is this just Jimmie's unconscious mind filtering away all these strange and wonderful images? But it leaks, it's coming out, isn't it? You can't keep it all down.
Yeah, I think that's what's happening.
Okay.
Like he's not losing it, but I think he's just sort of breaking out of that. I like that image you had there of the kind of psychological uniform. I think he's decided to take it off, you know, and is sort of, I think, hoping a little bit he's gonna get fired for something, because he hates that job, but also he doesn't, when you don't like your job, but maybe you don't have the courage to quit, and you sort of hope maybe you just gonna fire. I got fired a few times, and it's it's upsetting, but then there's also something nice about it, when you allow yourself that freedom to just get fired. It's kind of nice. It's not only nice, and I think it's a little bit a fantasy as well. He is, in the sense that he takes those liberties, but also is a bit unhinged. And I like also in other people's work, I like escalations. I find escalations very, I don't know if you think about Yasmina Reza or something like that, if you take a situation and you just slowly let it escalate. And I think that's what he's doing as well, or what's happening with him, I guess. It's a sort of interesting dynamic there, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
He's letting go,
Yeah, and it's going to happen at some point. That's what it feels like, and perhaps that's true for all of us. Back to the first scene in the novel, it's going to come out at some point, isn't it? It's going to come out.
It will, exactly.
The body knows more than the mind sometimes, doesn't it?
I think that's very true, yeah, and maybe it's healthier what he's doing in the long run, not in the short run.
So, as part of this event, we had a reading from a Leeds-based poet, an upcoming Leeds-based poet called Kirsty Wendt. She delivered 3 poems for us at the start of the event. You're going to hear that set as well in the break for this episode of the podcast. This is Kirsty Wendt with 3 poems.
Beneath lips. Ribbed star skirt, pleats crumpled beneath your legs. Calf swinging, you twirl your finger about the pot and suck between your nail and its bed. Sip, sip, 2-handed cup, enough! Straw tucked under your lip. Your sister's calling you. He sits with fixed pupils, little screen reflecting black at him, so down you slip, pigtails wedged between stool heads. You bite and chew, fishing for old skin, peeling as he bites a chip, leaving you bleeding blindly from your lip. Bodies of mine. I was born of women unadored, but my ancestors must have loved, for I drown in the unused affection of my grandmother and her mother before, yearning for bodies of mine denied tenderness. I ask God if they live within me, or if I within them. He does not answer. Mary cries back. I cannot read her muffled sobs. Did Mary love Joseph? Can a child love a child? I ache, but I refuse to ache alone. If I must carry this pain, I shall bear it and love the earth instead. Loose daughter. She inhaled the earth as she slept, tiny body moving and twisting, little legs stretching, little hands clutching, reaching, grasping for something to drag her from her own quiet mind. I sit, legs crossed, then uncrossed, less menacing. Menacing how? My hands reach, flipping the page. Hands over ears, mugs clink, wafer-thin pages scratch against nails, dampened to be lifted. Her shoes half my size, her skin a different colour, her hair curling as mine never would. Yet my mind wanders, winding down a path that does not exist. Her head upon my chest, hands loosely braiding. Mother, daughter, stranger.
Are there any questions? If not, I can keep going.
I'll ask a question.
Please do.
Hi, so something you sort of referencing is interesting now. There's a lot about voice in your work, and I kind of wanted to know what that. I've only read The Appointment, but it felt really like relentless in a good way. But where does that relentlessness and comic kind of vulgarity, where does it come from, and what's it doing?
Comes from my sad mind. No, it. I think there is a. Because usually for me it starts with voices, like they appear in my head. That sounds weird, but they just sort of the voice for The Appointment just suddenly started speaking. And I also think I'm much more interested in the inner landscapes of people than in descriptions. I don't really like, lengthy descriptions in books. There's this brilliant interview with, the Austrian writer Thomas Bernhard. They interviewed him, and he absolutely hated descriptions in books. And he said some authors, they waste like 60 pages and they got to the end of their front garden and it's fucking annoying, And I quite like that. So I find, also my brain always struggles a bit to process, lengthy descriptions of things. I personally find it quite boring. And I'm much more interested in the kind of drama that happens inside of people, and also what happens if you let people speak, this thing about communication, like and also what happens if you let yourself say the things you would really like to say. And in The Appointment, I sort of just followed that voice, and I think it's also about not having any filters or inhibitions on, just allowing yourself to do that. And I personally find it more interesting than describing sunsets, or I don't know. I always struggle with that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you for that. I wouldn't mind following on from that if we can, but if there's any other questions, I'm happy to open it up. We'll keep going. Perhaps something. Just raise your hand or just shout. Don't do that. Just raise your hand. Why not? Shout. Don't shout. But is the novel, and your first book translated into loads of languages, this is now being translated into a lot of languages. Your first novel struggled to get a publisher in Germany. And thinking about because of the themes around some of the things you say about German history, themes you talk about in here, is the novel still the space to break these boundaries, perhaps, in the modern age?
I think it should be. It isn't always, I think. A lot of things have become quite tame, I think. People are also maybe afraid of touching on certain subjects. But I think it should be. I know books are not as important as they used to be, but I think I like to believe that they still are, and that because a novel is also a very intimate space, because you are most of the time you are alone with the book, and it's just you and your mind, and I think ideally a lot can happen there. So I think for me it remains an interesting space.
Yeah, on Bernhard, I think he provides the epigraph to this novel. I think it was you that told me this, that he hated Vienna. He hated the city he was from. And just this idea of what home means, what comfort means. And I don't know if that's anything related to perhaps why Bernhard was such an influence, or, where are the comforts? Where can we feel comfortable and have those spaces to release ourselves? Let that be who we are. Where does Jimmie find who he is? Or does he?
Well, in his own mind, I think, but also I think in those conversations, I think he does enjoy a lot of those conversations, and he likes listening to people, I think, and it's something that makes conversations enjoyable if you allow yourself to listen to the other person, I think, which we don't always do. And Thomas Bernhard, I have a lot of admiration also for a lot of his discipline, because I think he was a very disciplined writer. But I think comfort is also a dangerous thing. Comfort isolates, I think, and I think we are very preoccupied in some ways with comfort. And I often say this, but I do hate the woolly socks and the coffee mugs and on Instagram and the books becoming like a pretty object. I think they can do more than that, I think, ideally.
I think I know what you're talking about.
Walk back into the world.
The kind of bookstagram pictures of book. Okay, it's a cultural idea of what a book is, I guess, isn't it? They have a status, an object status, don't they? I don't know if there's any more questions. Oh, we've got a couple.
Oh.
I'll let Eden go first, and then I'll come to you, Pete. Is that okay?
It was just building on that bookstagram point. I've found a real trend that yes, there is a space for this bookstagram, romantasy, no shade, but like there is a big world for that at the moment. But then there's also a huge trend for a wonderfully weird book, which I hope you would find a compliment. I would put this book in that category.
That's true.
And we're seeing like a lot more of that, and I think that's come from post-COVID. People, and I'd maybe say in Britain as well, people are wanting to read a bit more unusual, and we're becoming a bit freer as Brits. Like I can't imagine. It's a bit more like a commercial book, like All Fours by Miranda July. So people are starting to pick up books like that that are just like really like gender bending and stuff like that. And I'd say this is one of those, which I think is wonderful, and we're seeing lots of like weird books. What's your take on that? Do you think that that's like a trend do you think this is a temporary trend, that like books are becoming a bit freer and there is a bit more, we're not as prudish about books anymore, and that we can put a bit more like daring takes in them, or do you think we're not for that yet?
I think yes and no. I feel like there are two things happening at the same time. I think that is definitely happening. At the same time, a lot of things have become quite tame and quite prudish. So I think it's sort of, maybe that's a good thing. Two things happening at the same time. But my books are often described as too European. I don't quite understand what that means, but I think it means that they're too out there, and because Europeans don't shave their armpits and they're out there. I don't really understand what that means. But no, I think you're right. I think there is a sort of, on the one hand, maybe a little less prudishness, but then I often find things that are advertised as not being prudish to be very prudish at the same time. You know, the sort of, I don't want to quote the wrong thing, but then, you know, sometimes something is marketed as very sexually daring or whatever, and there's not a single penis in the book, you know, that kind of stuff. And you're like, okay, but what? I don't understand this. So, but I think there are two things happening. I think there are a lot of things happening at the same time why it's so confusing. But my book was chosen for a weird book club, and I said, okay, that's nice.
I think it's the highest compliment.
Thanks, Eden. It's a great question. Pete, and then we'll go for one more question. You had your hand up, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I don't know if it's a great question. It's around the experience of writing the book, and I feel like there's some genres that have this inherent inertia around it's definitely going to come to like a resolution in some sense. And I just wondered if you felt that and you knew it would resolve in some way. Did you know it would resolve in this subversive way? At what point did that come about?
It's often when your editor says you do need some plot, and No, I think I did want it, because I think it has to end somewhere, but it's not a very conclusive ending, I would say. But it did start more with that mood and the character and the voice, but it had to sort of go somewhere, maybe have a little bit of tension, and then in my obsession with 90s telephone sex things, I felt that was quite a nice way of ending it, of letting him have some of that intimacy he was so keen to find, I think. But I think a lot of writers are quite, I don't know what it's like for you, but plot is not so interesting for them, but then their editor's like, oh, but plot is very interesting, you know, for me. And then you have to reach some kind of compromise, I think, because otherwise it's maybe interesting for you but boring for everyone else. So I think you need a bit of tension. You need something to sort of, you know, drive the narrative along, even on a book like that, I think.
That's a good question, and it's a question about an ending, and I think we should bring it to a close there, Katharina.
Very good. Yeah,
did you like that?
Ask him to ask that question.
Didn't know. What's next, Katharina? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, I'm working on something new, because this book is it's not quite old, but it's, I wrote it some time ago, and I've been working on something else. I'm working on some theatre projects, so lots of interesting things. Yeah.
Well, we can't wait for whatever that is, but we've got this right now. Calls may be recorded for training and monitoring purposes. Released by Indigo Press. Katharina Volckmer, it has been my pleasure to welcome you to Leeds. Thank you so much for coming up here.
Excellent.
I hope you've enjoyed it. Let's give it up for Katharina Volckmer, everybody. Going to hang around, sign some books. If anyone wants to buy some copies, get some copies. Buy from Eden, bring it to you to sign. Let's just also give a big round of applause to Kirsty one more time. And my thanks, and if you want to give yourselves a round of applause, but thanks for coming out, supporting literary events in Leeds. Stay around, buy a book, have a bit of a chat, but for now, thank you very much for joining us at the Hyde Park Book Club.